Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Empowering Musicians podcast. I'm Michael Manley and I am a musician, arts and labor advocate, writer, educator, and coach. And I'm very happy to be welcoming Stephen Caplan to this week's episode. And Stephen is the professor of oboe at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and is also a very active performer and an expert in a technique called body mapping. Which has to do with body awareness and how we move. So welcome, Stephen.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah. So before we get into what body mapping actually is, why don't you tell us how you got involved in thinking about the human body and its relationship to how we play and how we move?
Well, I think for lots of musicians, maybe all musicians, it starts pretty early on. You just want to play better and you want it to feel easier. And so you start exploring all kinds of things, and there are different paths that people take to try to find more ease in their playing. Something that got in my way, and maybe it got in your way because you're a French horn player, and it just seems like a really normal thing when you're first handed a French horn or you're first handed an oboe by the band director, you're starting beginning band. They always tell you, oh, this is the most difficult instrument you could possibly play. You've got to be really smart to play this, stuff like that. And so right from the beginning, I was told it was supposed to be hard to play this instrument, the oboe that I play. And so I just accepted that it was hard. And my first teacher, who was a tremendous teacher, he played with a lot of tension in his playing. So that was kind of my model. But even though he sounded beautiful, there was a lot of tension. And so again, it's okay though, because the oboe's hard, right? But of course, like I said, I wanted to make it easier. And so I was striving for that. And then I got very lucky and I went to Northwestern University for my undergraduate degree, which was a big move. I'm originally from Louisiana, a small city in Louisiana, and I moved to the big city of Chicago up north. But I was able to work with Ray Still, who is a legendary oboist for 40 years, principal of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And he's someone who is known to bring a lot of ease to his playing. He was people marveled at his incredible breath support when he played the oboe, and so he was leading me in that direction. And really, he turned my playing inside out. And the other thing that was fantastic, of course, being in Chicago, part of the reason Ray Still and so many of those Chicago symphony musicians were trying to find this path towards greater ease and efficiency in their playing was largely because of an incredible brass player there, the tuba player Arnold Jacobs. Absolutely. And so Ray actually introduced me to Arnold, and Jake, we called him, and I took several private lessons with Jake as well while I was there. So I mean, it was mainly the breathing mechanism that we were exploring, but of course, as wind players, the breathing really is everything. If you can figure out how to breathe in a more free and easy manner, everything else about your playing improves almost immediately. So those were the things that got me started thinking about the body and the way the body worked, especially working with Jake. He actually had skeletal models in the studio like I have now. He talked about the anatomy and the biology and how it worked a little bit when he worked with musicians. I also started to have a little bit of an experience with the Alexander technique, which has helped so many musicians. And I saw a demonstration actually while I was at Northwestern of an Alexander teacher working with a cellist. And it was just so bizarre to me that here's the cellist, using their hands with a bow on the strings, which is, sitting between their legs. And this teacher was just making these movements with their neck. Like, what does the neck have to do with playing a cello? They're using their fingers, they're using their arms. But all of a sudden, after just 5 minutes of something this teacher was doing with this student's neck, they sounded completely different. The sound had so much more presence to it, and they were playing more effortlessly with more accuracy. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so I kind of couldn't afford it then, but that was back in my memory bank. So later on, I was able to take Alexander lessons, and that got me even more interested. And yeah, eventually it led me to Barbara Conable, who actually is a premier Alexander teacher. She wrote a book called How to Learn the Alexander Technique, which is now kind of a staple that's used in many Alexander courses all over the world. And she's an amazing woman who also wrote a book called What Every Musician Needs to Know About the Body, because she worked with so many musicians over her career, and she felt like musicians really needed to understand the body better. She saw a need because she saw that there was so much misinformation in the music world about how movement worked and how the body worked. And that misinformation was getting in people's way of finding the freedom that they want, and not only getting in the way of finding the freedom they needed to play better, but what people went to Barbara for specifically was when they got injured from making music. Something about playing their instrument gave them tendonitis or lockjaw or something like this. So she was a real miracle worker and worked with musicians who had already worked with other Alexander teachers or other physical therapists, and variety. They'd gone to medical doctors, and in some cases even had been told they had to just give up playing altogether because whatever the problem was had just gotten so serious and it couldn't be corrected. And then after several lessons with Barbara Conable, the person not only was playing again, but they were actually playing better than they'd ever played before. So there's something to this work she was doing. Like I said, she started out as an Alexander technique teacher, but she actually developed what we now call body mapping. And so I was really intrigued when I read her book, What Every Musician Needs to Know About the Body. I was in Las Vegas at the time. I've been here, believe it or not, over 30 years now.
Wow.
And so I went up to Portland, Oregon, where Barbara was, and took a workshop with her. And I got a private lesson, and that made me even more intrigued by all of this because I immediately saw how it was that difficult instrument of the oboe. So at that point, I was a professional oboist. I had a job. I had made recordings. I had traveled all over the world. I was considered a success. And I think I played very well. You can hear my recordings from back then and decide for yourself. But the point is, it still felt difficult to me. Even after all the self-exploration I had done, it's still, I was still sweating sometimes when I played, and veins were popping in my neck a lot. And it just felt hard to get to the end of a phrase and stuff. And so that's why I was so intrigued by this work that Barbara was doing, because immediately she was giving me answers to why that tension was still there. And she was helping me to find ways to release it and to find a whole different way of playing the instrument. And of course, of teaching the instrument. And so I continued to do work with her. I ended up getting a sabbatical from UNLV, and I actually moved to Portland, Oregon for several months. And I just became Barbara's assistant. I followed her everywhere. I watched every workshop she gave. I took all kinds of lessons with her. And it was a really fantastic experience. And eventually I was licensed to do this work myself, the body mapping work, and teach it to others. And she also encouraged me, of course, to share this work with other people, and specifically oboe players. She felt like her book, What Every Musician Needs to Know About the Body, was a little bit, general for any musician. But there are things that individual musicians learn related to body mapping and the specific technique you need for the instrument you play, whether it's French horn, piano, double bass, whatever. And so there were many discoveries that I made with Barbara specifically related to the oboe, and many that I made just on my own, because that's one of the beautiful things about body mapping. A lot of it is just a self-exploration. Once you understand the underlying principles, you do the work yourself. You don't have to rely on somebody else to do it for you. Which is a little bit of a drawback with some other things like Feldenkrais method or Alexander technique, as wonderful as they are. So anyway, Barbara, being the wonderful mentor that she was, encouraged me to write a book for oboe players, which became Oboe Motions.
Great.
There it is.
Oh, fantastic.
Every oboe player needs to know about the body.
That's great.
And that's been out for just a little over 10 years now. And it really established me. Nobody in the oboe world had ever written anything like that before. So it kind of established me as a leader in this field. And I've really traveled all over the country, all over the world, doing workshops and master classes to introduce these principles to other double reed players so they understand, no, the oboe really doesn't have to be the most difficult instrument. In fact, it's really just about as easy as any other. I mean, basically all instruments, if you want to play them at a really high level, they're all hard, but there's nothing about the oboe that's really more hard than any other instrument. So, so that's one of the messages I tried to get to oboe players.
That's great. There's so much here I want to talk about and unpack. And I'm going to start with Barbara Conable. And so for those of you who don't know, Alexander technique was a method for really being aware of our bodies. And I think the word Barbara used was proprioception, which is, I don't know how you define that, but it's like knowing where we are and being kind of aware of our biomechanics, right?
Right. There's proprioception actually is used in a lot of different ways by some people use it in a very general way, like you're talking about, that includes what we feel inside our body, which more specifically might be labeled kinesthesia, but also includes things like our position in space and how we're moving in space and stuff like that. So it's kind of a broad term, but that's something many musicians don't have an awareness. Now, musicians, when I say that, they're like, well, we talk about movement all the time in my lessons. And that's true for decades, maybe hundreds of years. People have talked about movement in relation to music. They talk about how the fingers work on the violin or on an oboe. They talk about how your lips move on the French horn or the trombone or oboe again. But they forget that the only reason the lips can move and the only reason the fingers can move is because they're attached to other things. The fingers are attached to a hand, which is attached to an arm, which is attached to the rest of your body and very much influenced by the way you're holding your spine. And so unless you have more of a whole body understanding of movement, you're not really teaching movement properly. And that's been one of the big problems with our teaching of movement in music in general over the years.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on. And I know I was fortunate enough, I was on a tour and a friend of mine, we were coming through Columbus, Ohio, I believe it was. And this keyboard player mentioned that he was going to see this Alexander teacher. And so I was really curious, and it was a very heavy show and, lots and lots of playing. And, I was having some issues. And so I thought, well, let me give this a try. And I had a lesson with Barbara, and it was amazing. And I saw her over the years a couple times because I would do other tours and come through there. But one of the things that I remember was so striking to me was I was having a lot of pain in my right hand. And with the French horn, we support the instrument with our hand. And so, and my horn happened to be a more heavy horn as far as how much it weighed. And so I was like, well, this horn is just heavy and I'm having all this pain in my hand. And so I was able to hook up with Barbara and get a lesson. And she said, well, show me what you're doing. And I just went like this, and I didn't even touch my instrument. And she saw that I was tensing all my fingers at once before I put my hand on the pedal. And she just said, stop doing that. And I was like, oh. And immediately I had no more pain. And so
because that tension is going to go all the way down your arm and all the way up into here.
Yeah. And the thing that I found so transformative about her work was I realized that I had to not do more, but stop doing. And a lot of it is about undoing. And in brass pedagogy, there's a lot of teaching that talks about, tension in the face and the embouchure. And I realized that like all of that was not necessary, and I could just relax and just play. And it's all about finding that ease and efficiency.
Absolutely.
And body mapping, I think, differs from Alexander technique in one key area that I'm aware of, which is that you talk about if you have an incorrect perception of how your body works, you're going to behave according to that misperception, right?
Well, that's the crux of the brain map and the body map, that we actually, habits. There's so much new research into how the brain works. And the neuroscience is just an amazing field to be in right now, because they're discovering so many things, and they're able to discover things because of new technologies where they're able to put electrodes on the brain and, you know, see exactly what parts of the brain are lighting up, and, you know, a lot of really amazing things. So habits are formed in the neural network. Certain parts of the brain fire at the same time and wire together, and over time they create our habits, our way of being. And Alexander technique and these other things, body mapping, we're working with those deep-seated underlying habits that many people don't even think of as something that can be changed. Just how you're sitting in the chair right now, how you stand, how you walk across the room. Those are things that most people just say, well, that's me, you know, and then they'll think about the fact that you actually could be a different me. You might not need to be. A lot of people walk and sit and stand in a very natural, efficient, wonderful way. But a lot of people also don't. And when you're sitting for long periods of time with the French horn, the way you're sitting actually makes a huge difference in the music that comes out of the horn. And so that's why working with something as simple as just how you're sitting in the chair can drastically affect the music that you're making. So yeah, we're with body mapping, we're trying to get people to bring to consciousness those deep-seated habits. What is it about me, that thing that I call me, when I stand, when I sit, when I bring the French horn to my mouth? Everybody, like right in the beginning, when you start having a relationship with whatever instrument you have, your body has certain habitual ways of moving towards playing that instrument. And so I played piano for years, and I just think about playing the piano, and immediately certain muscles in my body react just to the thought. I don't even have to have the piano in front of me. And the same with the oboe, obviously, because I've played it for so many years. I just think about playing the oboe and my body starts, if you're really tuned into your body, you notice that there's certain parts of you that start moving in a subtle way towards the instrument, and it doesn't even have to be there. So that's what we're questioning, is why are you moving that way? Is that something that's going to help you play the oboe better? Or is it something that might actually be getting in your way of playing the oboe as freely as you want? And that's what I found for myself. I had many unfortunate habits that were getting in my way, most of them related to how I held the head in relation to the neck and the back. And many people do this on brass and woodwind instruments. They go to the instrument, they go forward and down, what Alexander called a downward pull. They go down toward the instrument, and as they concentrate more on difficult passage work, and they get freaked out because the conductor's doing weird stuff like that, they pull down even more. And all of that just brings attention to the arms, to the neck, to the breathing mechanism, to so many different things. And it gets in your way of having the freedom and ease that you want, and the ability to play very long phrases, or to hit the high notes with the beautiful sound that you want, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's why body mapping is so powerful, I think, because it is getting to something, those very deep-seated habits. And that gets back to exactly what you were saying earlier. A lot of what we're doing, a lot of it's learning, but probably just as much is unlearning as learning, because we're trying to unlearn those deep-seated habits if they are getting in our way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that's really, I know I was affected by this, but a lot of French horn players play with the horn on their leg, and some hold it up. And like some teachers insist that their students play with the horn on their leg. But you have to be really, really conscious of what that does. And for me, I have a very long torso and short legs. So if I put the horn on my leg, my mouthpiece is kind of coming at my neck. And if I bring myself to the horn, I'm just going to create all kinds of problems. So yeah.
This is what I loved about body mapping, because this happens in so many different variations for every instrument, and for the way the human voice, our singing, is taught in music schools as well. Very well-intentioned teachers are trying to pass on something to their students. So for your teacher, it may have worked for them to put the horn on their leg because their torso in relation to their leg was just the right, proportions that it worked just fine. There are some people that can have the French horn on their leg and they won't pull their head down like this, or it won't, by putting it on their leg, they avoid that strain in the hand that you were talking about. So that's why people like to do it. But there are many other ways to do it. Some people just bring if they want to put it on their leg, if you use a footstool, like the guitarist uses a footstool, or just put a yoga block under your foot or something like that, then the leg is put in a position where it's okay for your torso. So you can make adjustments like that. Are there other ways? Now, of course, there's support systems you can use. Or like you said, if you just learn how to really sit in a way where the chair is supporting you and the spine is supporting the way your head sits up here, then the horn actually feels a lot lighter than it does otherwise. And maybe you don't need to rest it against anything. So body mapping is teaching the underlying principles of what you need for your technique, and then you make the adjustments that work for you, for your particular body type, and for the type of sound you want to get musically. And there's a lot of flexibility there, as long as you're honoring the integrity of the body and how it's supposed to work in movement. And so that's what a lot of it is, learning how it should be working in movement in the most efficient way. And so we want to honor that. And that trumps the idea of just doing what your teacher told you, because your teacher was a great player and sounded fantastic. Well, that's because they figured something that worked for them, but it might not be exactly right for you. And that's where body mapping really helped me a lot.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you mentioned, because I was extremely jealous when you mentioned Arnold Jacobs, because he's such a sort of really important figure in the brass pedagogy world, and the fact that you got to study with him is amazing. But here's what I'm thinking, because I always thought, well, Arnold Jacobs is the guy you go to figure out how to get, how to really maximize the lung capacity you have to play long phrases on brass instruments. And oboe, I always associate with, they don't need a lot of air because it's so there's so much resistance, and they often have to get rid of air. So how does an oboist study with Arnold Jacobs, and what is the learning that you got from that?
Well, when I studied with him, gosh, it's almost 40 years ago now. And then I went back later. Actually, when I first came to UNLV, our horn professor here wanted to go to a summer workshop he was doing. And so I went up to Chicago in the summer then, much later, and spent a week and observed him teaching other people, but I actually got a lesson with him at that point too. So I did work with him once as a professional later on as well. But back then, and unfortunately still today, but it was more prevalent back then, there was a way of teaching breathing for wind players that really taught a lot of built-in tension. People were told they had to make their stomach really firm and keep it firm the whole time they played. I had teachers that put their fist in my belly button and you're supposed to push against their fist, or they put you on the floor and they put a bunch of books on top of your stomach, and so there was a lot of misconceptions like that were being taught, and people were told that's going to give you a better sound if you think like that. And if you think of being on the toilet and grunting and stuff, which causes like the Valsalva maneuver, which a lot of oboists do, you hear noises from the throat and stuff because they've got all this excess pressure that they're using. So part of it was he was such a great teacher of just a more realistic way of breathing that didn't involve all that excess tension that was being taught generally in the wind world back then. So that's part of what he gave me. But more specifically, like I said, he and Ray Still spent a lot of time together when Ray first joined the Chicago Symphony, figuring out what this thing you were talking about. Oboe is a lot different from tuba. They're like on the opposite ends of spectrum as far as how you use the air. But Jake was just intrigued by it, and he wanted to help Still figure out how can we work with something that is completely opposite of the tuba and help you to feel more comfortable with what you're doing. So he had a way of teaching alternating exhaling with inhaling, and of course one of the most powerful things with Jake was his just teaching of basic music making, like what your mind should be thinking about in performance, how you have to have an external focus of just a really intense understanding of how you want to sound, of really taking the time to imagine in as much detail as possible the exact sound you want, and let that guide you a lot more than any anatomy. And this is something we work with in body as much as we work with the anatomy and teach people that, especially people who have gotten in trouble and have been injured. Obviously, those people are on the wrong path. So we want to help them, and understanding how the body works and the anatomy is really important, but that's important for explorations in the practice room. In performance, you shouldn't be thinking about what your shoulder is doing or what your wrist is doing at all. You really only should be thinking about the music. And so Jake had a wonderful way of teaching how we let the music be our guide to help us find the ease we want with our body. And so I learned that from him as well. And fortunately, a lot of people don't know his name now, but there's a lot of great students that are trying to keep his legacy alive. So there are a couple of books where if people want to find out more about Arnold Jacobs, they can read about him. But there are also some great videos that they've put together. There's an Arnold Jacobs YouTube channel or something, and I encourage people to go look at it, because you can hear him saying in his own words some of these things. I guess one of the biggest things that I've struggled with, though, is that dichotomy, and a lot of his students just say flat out they don't want to be working with body mapping, because Jake said don't think about what happens in your body, just think about listening to the sound. And then if you think about the internal way that you make things work, the body is so complex you can never understand it anyway, and you're just going to get focused on the wrong thing. It's going to make you mess up, paralysis by analysis is the phrase, stuff like that. And so I've wondered, is body mapping just completely the wrong way to go about learning music? But I can't think that, because it's been so powerfully helpful for me as a musician. And I know I've improved my playing because of it. So what I realized is, well, Jake himself knew more about anatomy than I'll ever know. He knew more than a lot of there were doctors that consulted him about how to work with musicians, because they knew he knew so much about it. It never stopped him from being a great musician, even
Right.
though he recognized that students maybe didn't have to go into it in the detail he did. But like I said, if somebody has been injured from playing their instrument, they do need to find out how their body works. They need to overcome that injury. And so that needs to be a priority. They need to take time to unlearn, to relearn, to remap, all those things. But those are explorations that happen in the practice room. And you don't even have to do them in connection to like the big orchestral excerpts or the big concerto you're about to play. Just do them playing scales or some beautiful long tones, and get a sense of what it would feel like to play with freedom and ease for the first time in your life, maybe. And when you do, you immediately hear the sound is better, it's fuller, it's richer, it's happening easier. So you get hooked on that. And why wouldn't you want to sound like that all the time? And so that becomes a motivation, exactly what Jake was talking about, that beautiful, warm, free sound. That's your motivation in performance. And that's all you need to think about. And because you've done the work in the practice room, those explorations of how the body works, the sound itself will trigger you into freedom. And that's exactly what Jake wanted. I actually did a whole hour-long lecture on this for one of the body mapping conferences, because I think it's so important to recognize that you kind of can have the best of both worlds. But there definitely needs to be one way of working with things in the practice room in the early stages of learning, and a different way of practicing for performance, which is all about just being in the moment with the sound and with communicating with your audience.
Yeah. And I think what you're referring to is kind of like a misconstruing of what Arnold Jacobs was saying, which was not that, in other words, like, I can't think about what my lips are doing. I can't give myself a direction to say my lips need to be in this place to play this note. But that's different than being aware of your body, right? That's different than just having an understanding of like, oh, let me feel where I'm connecting to the chair. It's so, yeah, but it's a totally different thing. And I think both are good. But his whole
I feel comfortable because I did have this personal experience of working with Jake. I feel comfortable having this conversation with people who don't believe this way. I think I have a little bit of authority that way. And like I said, the work I did with him was really profound, but I truly didn't understand breathing in its totality until I worked with Barbara Conable. There's just something much deeper about this whole body integration that you learn with Alexander technique, that really transforms you.
Yeah. That's great. And you work with other people besides oboists, right? You don't just work with oboists.
Oh, when my teaching now, I've developed coursework for our students here at UNLV, and I work with all of our music students, and it's really rewarding. I knew nothing about playing guitar, but the first guitarist I worked with, again, I just taught him how to sit better, and all of a sudden, everybody in the room heard a completely different guitar player in front of us. They sounded so much better, and I saw this big smile come on this person's face because it felt easier to them. He had been experiencing a lot of wrist pain, and that just disappeared all of a sudden. And so I was like, I don't have to know how to play the guitar to be able to help people. And it's a really great feeling. So I work with conductors, I work with string bass players, a lot of singers. Singers are very much attracted to this, and I enjoy working with singers because as an oboe player, I've always modeled my playing on singers. I've always admired singers. So yeah, I work with all kinds of musicians.
Yeah, that's great. And you started the conversation by talking about how we're given this story with oboe and French horn that they're hard. And that is so damaging, I think, to us when we start learning, because we think, oh, I have to do all this efforting, and then you develop all this tension, and then you realize later on, it's like, oh, wait, if it feels hard, I'm probably doing something wrong, right? And if I feel like I'm having to effort this phrase or whatever, I probably need to step back and say, how can I make this feel easy and effortless? That's what I notice in my own playing.
And that's the message that you need to be giving yourself in the practice room too. What can I do to find freedom and ease? I now have a little phrase in my head that every articulation is leading me towards freedom and love, instead of the articulation leading me towards tension and fear, which is what so many people do. And again, we talk about articulation, but it could be a pianist talking about their finger on the key. Every time my finger goes on the key, instead of triggering me into fear and tension, I see pianists who, as soon as the finger touches the key, you can visibly see the muscles in their forearm like just really tensing up. They don't have to tense up to put that key down to the bottom of the keypad. It needs almost no effort at all. So instead of it triggering tension and fear, the fear of exposing yourself to an audience, things like that, instead, every movement you make as a musician, whether it's an articulation or touching a string, moving the bow, whatever, it's triggering you towards more freedom in the way you use your body, and towards love, the love of the music itself, the love of being able to share this music with an audience, as opposed to being fearful of the experience. So that's what you should be promoting every single day in the practice room with your playing. And I promise you, if you do that, it's going to get better.
Yeah, and that's really profound. It's really philosophically very much related to mindset work, and that tension and that feeling of needing to be perfect is all about our ego. Whereas if we think about just sharing music and communicating, it's not about us. It's about the music, and so that's really an interesting connection there.
Yeah.
So how do people connect with you, Stephen, if they wanted to take lessons, or if they want to learn more about you or get your book?
My book is available. I also have a breathing book. And I would say if people are interested in body mapping in general, there's a website, bodymap.org. For brass players especially, because I'm sure you have a following with brass players here, there's a publishing company, Mountain Peak Music, a wonderful trombonist, David Vining, puts out things. And so my breathing book is published by Mountain Peak, but they have a lot of brass books about flow, playing with ease, body mapping related books for brass players. But you can find all that on the bodymap.org website. There's a huge variety of books now for pianists, for singers, for flutists, et cetera, et cetera. There are new ones coming out soon. There's one for clarinetists about to be published right now. I encourage people, if they're interested, contact me through my website, obomotions.com, or you can just email me at my email address. And of course, if you happen to be coming through Las Vegas, I'd be happy to work with you. And I love teaching. I teach a course here for graduate students in the fall on healthy music making, which includes hearing health and all the aspects, mental wellness, all the aspects of healthy music making. I teach it for grad students in the fall, and I teach one for undergrads in the spring. So I just finished teaching it. I had a great group of kids this semester, and I saw a lot of progress, especially in these hard times we've had with the pandemic. People, the mental stress of the pandemic and then getting back into playing after not having played for a year and a half, there's so many elements to that, and that mental stress has translated, unfortunately, into physical stress. And so I just saw with each one of these students that this work really helped them to find their center again and to be able to perform with more comfort.
Yeah. And it's reminding me that I really want to get back into this work myself, because I'm starting to do, practice and more serious practice. And I actually had COVID maybe 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and I feel like it's really affected my breathing. So I'm curious to learn maybe if that's all in my mind or if there's something I can do to improve that. But I know that's
not my door then. And
yes, I will
help you.
Yes, Hugo's the skeleton behind Stephen, for those of you listening. But yes, thank you so much, Stephen, for being here. And again, the website is obomotions.com. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so happy to have you with us. And it's what's the body mapping website again?
Bodymap.org.
Bodymap.org and obomotions.com. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care.
Mm-hmm.